The 1950 FIFA World Cup was supposed to be a triumphant celebration for Brazilian football, a tournament where they transformed from underachievers to world champions. Instead, it would climax in broken Brazilian hearts. However, they did not know it then, but from this disaster, their greatest icon would arrive. This is the story of the 1950 FIFA World Cup. This was the first tournament since 1938 and the fourth overall. The planned 1942 and 1946 editions were cancelled due to the global devastation of World War II. The effects of the war were felt during the host selection of the 1950 tournament too. Europe was still recovering when FIFA decided to resurrect the competition. As a result, FIFA struggled to find any interest in a host. Brazil finally presented a bid and it was quickly accepted. The next roadblock for FIFA was getting enough interest from teams to attend the tournament. Their biggest challenge was Italy. They were the long-standing world champions, having won both the 1934 and 1938 editions. They were hesitant to attend because their team was severely weakened due to the Superga air disaster, in which most of their starting lineup had been killed in 1949. Italy was persuaded to attend, but they understandably decided to travel by boat rather than plane. With the emergence of transatlantic flights, everyone else from Europe would fly to Brazil. Both Germany and Japan were banned due to their actions in World War II. Many Eastern Europeans refused to participate. This included the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Ultimately, Yugoslavia became the only Eastern European participant. With both Brazil and Italy automatically qualifying, this left 14 spots available for the 16-team competition. A total of 34 teams would attempt to qualify. However, once the qualification process began, there were further problems as several teams would withdraw. Argentina, Ecuador, and Peru withdrew after the draw, which meant Chile, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Uruguay qualified by default. In Asia, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Burma all withdrew. This meant India qualified by default. Unfortunately, before the World Cup, India also pulled out. The more accepted reason is due to the expense of travelling across the globe to Brazil. A second reason is that allegedly, India refused to wear shoes and thus could not take part. Either way, India holds an unwanted record of being the only team to have qualified for a World Cup, but have never played a match in their history. There was one piece of good news for FIFA. For the first time, the British nations decided to enter the World Cup. After 17 years of self-exile from FIFA, the English FA finally rejoined in 1946. It was decided that the annual home nation tournament would be the qualifying format. The top two would qualify. However, bizarrely, Scottish FA chairman George Graham declared Scotland would only go to Brazil if they won the group. Scotland would finish runners-up to England, and despite protests from the players, George stubbornly refused to change his mind, and Scotland withdrew. After all that confusion, 13 places out of the expected 16 finally took part in the World Cup. The additional spots were not filled due to a lack of time. England were the only team making their debut. Once again, a new format was introduced for the competition. Instead of straight knockout games, there would be 4 groups where the winners would qualify for a final group. The winner of the final group would be the world champions. Brazil proposed this format to increase the number of games and thus generate more money to cover the costs of building the stadiums. Instead of 16 games like previous editions, this World Cup would have 30 games. It ended up being 22 games due to the 3 missing teams. FIFA initially rejected this idea, but grudgingly agreed when Brazil threatened to pull out as hosts. Before moving on to the main tournament, I would appreciate a like, a subscribe, and hit the notification bell. After the turmoil, the 1950 FIFA World Cup finally kicked off on the 24th of June. The first group consisted of Brazil, Yugoslavia, Mexico, and Switzerland. Brazil entered with great optimism. They were at this time a prosperous nation and had built the Maracanã Stadium with an enormous capacity of 200,000. As a football nation, they had emerged as a serious contender to the established South American superpowers of Argentina and Uruguay. They had breathtakingly won the 1949 Copa America by scoring 39 goals in just 7 matches. That's an average of close to 6 goals per match. Brazilian manager Flávio Costa imposed a strict 4-month training regime going into the World Cup. Strict nutrition, 10 p.m. curfews, and no women, including their wives. They confidently began their campaign by swatting aside Mexico in the opening game 4-0. The star of the show was forward 𝐼𝐸, who scored 2 of the goals. The first sign of cracks came in their second game, as they conceded a late goal to the Swiss as the game finished 2-2. Brazilian fans did not react well, and trainer Flávio Costa needed a police escort out of the stadium. Despite this hiccup, Brazil would go on to win the group comfortably by defeating Yugoslavia 2-0 in their final game. Group 2 contained England, Spain, Chile, and the USA. England was overwhelmingly favoured to win the group. This confidence may have crossed over into complacency, as their preparation was lackluster at best. Before flying to Brazil, the FA decided it was too expensive to fly early, so the players had less time to acclimatise to Brazilian conditions. In terms of training, England had just 3 to 4 days before the flight. Even more strangely, they did not bring along Sir Stanley Matthews, their best player. The FA had sent him on a goodwill tour to Canada. He would not join the team until much later. Perhaps worse of all were the conditions when they arrived. Nobody from the FA bothered visiting the hotel selected for the team in advance. England's leading goalscorer recalled, "The food was terrible. I remember the cold ham and fried eggs swimming in black oil. We were eating bananas mostly." Stan Mortensen put it more bluntly, "Even the dustbins had ulcers." Most of the team had sick stomachs at least once during the stay. Despite all this, the English players were still in full confidence. They even took time out to watch Brazil beat Mexico 4-0. Matthews would later say, "At the end of the match, I was convinced England would win the World Cup if Brazil was our chief danger." Despite the build-up, the tournament started well enough as England beat Chile 2-0 at the Maracanã, where every English pass was booed by the Brazilian crowd. The players and the media were brimming with confidence. English reporter 𝐾𝐨𝐧'𝐿 said, "I have no doubt now that they will beat Spain and the USA and win the group championship. This was as good an England team as I've seen for a very long time." What followed was one of the most embarrassing results in English football history. In their second game, England would face 500-1 outsiders, the USA. The USA were coming off a 3-1 defeat to Spain, so England was expected to win easily. The USA was a team of part-timers who had been hastily assembled for the competition. Matthews would not play the game, as it was decided he should be saved for tougher opponents. The English Daily Express newspaper wrote, "It would be fair to give the US 3 goals to start." Once the game began, it seemed like only a matter of time before the floodgates would open. England had chance after chance. After just 12 minutes, they had 6 shots at goal, with 2 hitting the post. The US would not have their first shot until the 25th minute. But this was just a brief respite from the English onslaught. Only the superb goalkeeping of Frank Borghi seemed to keep the game scoreless. Against all odds in the 37th minute, USA captain Walter Barr took a shot from 25 yards out that would have been easily saved. But 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐜𝐫𝐿 grazed the ball with his head, which took it past the English goalkeeper. The Brazilian crowd roared as the USA inexplicably led 1-0. England continued to attack before half-time, but the score remained 1-0. The crowd was initially at 10,000, but it began to increase as more Brazilians arrived after hearing the score. Barr would later say, "The overwhelming majority was Brazilians, but they rooted for us the entire time. We didn't realise why until after. They were hoping we would beat England and that Brazil would not have to play England in the final game." More of the same followed in the second half as England laid siege to the USA goal. England had countless chances, including penalty appeals, goal line clearances, disallowed goals, and hitting the woodwork a few more times. But astonishingly, the USA held on and beat England 1-0 in one of the biggest shocks in sporting history. The response back in England was one of complete shock, and some wondered if it was a hoax. In the US, the match received little attention, which highlights how small football still is in the country. The shock result would only get more attention in the build-up to the 1994 World Cup, where it became known as the Miracle Match. Despite this result, it was not over yet for England. They had a final game with Spain. If they won, both teams would be tied, and there would be a playoff to see who tops the group. Still, England failed to score as they lost 1-0 to a physical Spanish side in front of 80,000 at the Maracana. Just like that, England had been knocked out in the first round, having scored just 2 goals in 3 games. Spain proceeded through. Group 3 consisted of Sweden, Italy and Paraguay. With Italy weakened by the deaths of so many of their main starters, Sweden would capitalise, beat them 3-2 and win the group. Group 4 only had Uruguay and Bolivia. Uruguay demolished Bolivia with an 8-0 victory. The match seemed to have little interest, as only 5,000 people attended. The final group to determine the world champions was made up of Brazil, Spain, Sweden and Uruguay. This would be the first World Cup not to have a one-off final. Instead, whoever topped this group was crowned the winner. 2 games from each round of fixtures were played at the same time. In the opening round, Brazil continued their romp with a 7-1 demolition of Sweden in front of 138,000 fans. Brazilian 𝐼𝐸𝐵 scored an incredible 4 goals. Uruguay and Spain would play out an entertaining 2-2 draw. Spain was 2-1 up in the 39th minute, but Uruguay equalised in the 73rd minute. In the second round of games, Brazil continued their blistering form by smashing Spain 6-1 in front of 152,000 fans. 𝐼𝐸𝐵 continued his stunning performances with 2 more goals in the win. Brazil was just 1 game away from being champions. Uruguay and Sweden played out a thriller in São Paulo in front of just 8,000 fans. In a growing theme, Sweden was 1-0 and then 2-1 before half-time. Uruguay would snatch victory from defeat with 2 late goals in the 77th and 85th minutes to win 3-2. In the final group of games, Sweden would beat Spain in what was essentially the 3rd and 4th place playoffs. Sweden romped to a 3-0 lead before Spain scored a late consolation. The main attraction, and what became known as the de facto 1950 World Cup final, was between Brazil and Uruguay. Brazil had 4 points in the group, while Uruguay had 3. It was only 2 points for a win in those days. This meant Brazil only needed to avoid defeat to become champions. It was a must-win game for Uruguay. Due to Brazil's stunning form, the nation expected glory. Politicians and newspapers, so confident of a win, declared victory ahead of the game. In the 1949 Copa America, Brazil beat Uruguay 5-1, so Uruguay was not seen as a threat. On the morning of the 16th of July 1950, the streets of Rio de Janeiro were preparing for celebrations, including carnivals and many signs celebrating the World Cup win. Uruguay would use all the premature celebrations as motivation. They adopted an underdog mentality. Uruguay captain Obdulio Varela gave a passionate speech before the game. He expressed how they will fight against all odds, and we will not be intimidated by the fans. The match began as expected. Brazil attacked against the Uruguayan defensive line throughout the first half. But unlike the previous opponents, Uruguay held on and defended well as the half ended scoreless. But 2 minutes into the second half, Brazil finally managed to break the deadlock. São Paulo forward Friaca scored with a low shot. The crowd of 173,000 roared in celebration, but Uruguayan captain Varela continued to argue with the ref that the goal was offside. After a few minutes of arguing, the goal was confirmed, but the crowd had become more subdued. Varela then shouted to his players, "Now it's time to win." Uruguay managed to gain control of the game and exploit the poor Brazilian defense. Schiaffino scored an equalizer in the 66th minute. In the 79th minute, 𝐼𝐶𝐬𝐫𝐿 managed to break through on the right side of the field and scored a low shot past goalkeeper Barbosa from a tight angle. The crowd had become silent and was sitting stunned. Brazil sent more attacks, but to no avail. Uruguay won 2-1 and crushed Brazilian dreams. Uruguay were world champions. Brazilian fans cried throughout the country, but there was one fan crying that would change Brazilian football history. A 9-year-old saw his father crying for the very first time. He asked his father, "Why are you crying, Dad?" And he said to me, "Brazil have lost the World Cup." To which he replied, "Don't cry, Dad, I'll win the World Cup for you." that young boy would grow up to become Pelé. Notable stats include Uruguay becoming two-time champions in just 2 appearances in the World Cup. The 2 tournaments between their 2 wins, they chose not to enter. Ademir finished with the Golden Boot with 9 goals in just 6 games. Brazil were the top scorers with 22 goals from their 6 games. There were 88 goals scored in the 22 games, an average of 4 goals per match. Over 1 million fans attended the games. Well, there you have it. That was the story of the 1950 FIFA World Cup. A World Cup where both Brazil and England expected to win, but instead led to disaster.